small business owner. So you wish to be at one with your enterprise. First, you must attain inner peace of small business insurance. This is Zensurance.
If you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, or a contractor, peace of mind is just a click away at Zensurance.com, Canada's leading source for small business insurance. It's quick, easy, and affordable. Get an instant price today at Zensurance.com.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The simple candy bar is probably a good place to start. It hit $2 full at the corner store near my house sometime this year. And I buy a candy bar like once or twice a year. So who cares, right? But I cared. Even though I understood all the reasons for it, the tight margins, the supply chain issues, inflation, and everything else. I was still just mad. It's ridiculous. A regular-sized candy bar should cost no more than $1, maybe $1.25. And from that place, it is a very short leap to what are those fools in Ottawa doing? There are a lot of decent economic indicators for Canada right now. Inflation is finally under control. Interest rates are coming down in a hurry. Things are slowly getting better. But it doesn't feel that way when you fork over a toonie for a crunchy bar. This is the story of consumer rage and how it came to define this moment in Canadian politics. Economics are supposed to be hard, cold numbers with no room for your feelings. It turns out, sometimes, not so much. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Ira Wells is a Toronto-based writer who examined the politics of inflation and consumer rage in The Walrus. Hello, Ira.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You are most welcome, and I think we should start with examples because I'm sure everybody listening has one. First, you tell me about your sandwich, and I'll tell you about my lunch, and everybody can imagine their own example of consumer rage.
Okay, well, I have to admit, Jordan, that my lunch today consists of a homemade peanut butter sandwich with a little bit of homemade jam as well, because frankly, I can't afford the $21 sandwiches that I wrote about in this piece.
Tell me about that $21 sandwich. Was it good? It must have been delicious.
I have no complaints. It was a very fine sandwich, crafted by a true artist of the form. No complaints about the sandwich. It was fantastic. The indigestion came at the cost, which, as I say in the piece, was $21, including tax and a 15% tip. I don't know about you. I always feel inclined to, I feel very guilty about the tipping function that pops up automatically.
We've done entire episodes about the tipping function that pops up automatically.
This was just for the sandwich, I might add. This was not at a fast food outlet. This was not including the chips and the pop and the proverbial meal.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's not surprising to me. It's probably not surprising to anybody listening who lives in a big city. I will tell you a story about a wonderful little authentic Korean street food place that is around the corner from our work. And I always used to consider it the height of indulgence to get lunch there because they make this incredible dish, but it costs $20 all told, again, without a drink or anything like that. And 4 or 5 years ago, when I would get it maybe once a month, it was a true indulgence. But now I might as well have the authentic Korean street food every day because a pad thai at Thai Express is $21. A combo at A&W is $18.99, Ira.
Yeah, no, exactly. The price of a McDonald's meal can now put you back almost $20, which, I'm 43 years old. McDonald's was sort of the thing that everyone could afford when I was growing up, and it was a sort of benchmark of an inexpensive meal. But it's really the price of everything, right? It's not just food. This is the stuff that we see on a more regular basis. But the big ticket items are also creeping up. The price of a new car, an average new car in Canada? $67,817.
$67,000. Oh my gosh.
Which again, I come from a time where that's you got to be getting some serious luxury for $67,000. I mean, that should be like a Jaguar or a fancy BMW or something. But this is the average car in Canada is now costing almost $70,000.
Okay, so, everybody knows, and as you mentioned, it's not any one thing. We've been dealing with inflation for a few years, and actually the rate of inflation is coming down, and we can talk about whether or not that matters in a little bit. But what I want to ask you first is, because you get at this really well in the piece, is, we all understand about inflation. We know we've been dealing with it, but why does it feel different when it hits you in places like McDonald's or a sandwich shop?
I think it has to do with the sort of quotidian, everyday aspect of it. And it flies in the face of the evidence, right? Because the economists will tell you that inflation hits hardest in terms of sheer dollar value in those big ticket prices.
Right. In
the new cars, those big expensive things are where you're really going to pay much more in terms of inflation. But it's the little things. It's the olive oil that's gone up, doubled in the last couple of years, or, the price of food overall, and I don't mean in terms of restaurant food, but groceries. Canada's food price report, which comes out yearly, tells us that the average family of 4 can expect to spend just a little over $16,000 on groceries, which is up by about $1,000 from the year before, and is predicted to go up by almost another $1,000 next year. So obviously there's the grumbling about the cost of these things is a fact of life. I can certainly remember my grandparents recalling how in the olden days you could buy a bottle of Coke for 10 cents or what have you, but
right.
It's just kind of everywhere. And it's these daily quotidian things that are just serve as a kind of constant reminder in the back of your mind. And I think it gives people the feeling that they are out of control or that they have no control over their finances.
And this is, historically speaking, over the long haul, not an entirely new phenomenon. But maybe if you could just kind of define, quote unquote, consumer rage for us, and how does it have that history of boiling over occasionally?
Yeah, so consumer rage is a thing. I don't know if there's a standard sociological definition, but it exists, and politicians know it exists when it rears its head. And there are many examples throughout history where consumers have just snapped after a period of docility. And I learned a little bit about this as I was researching the piece for the Walrus, about how, when you think of the 1960s, you think of these big social movements and protests that were rocking major cities across the U.S., the Vietnam War, Stonewall, and so on, all the social turmoil. But there was also one called the Housewife Revolt. Not language that we would use today, but
right.
This happened in 1966 when there was a middle-class woman who the media referred to as Mrs. Paul West, who had apparently noted that the price of olives had shot up 4 times in the course of a month. She took issue with this and approached the management and raised her concerns, and they essentially told her to go back to the cooking and leave the pricing to the experts. And Mrs. West didn't like this very much and started organizing and eventually started this with the media called the Housewives Revolt, where there were hundreds of women with placards in the streets and many thousands of others were participating in different ways and boycotting all of the major grocery retailers in Denver. And by the time they were through, the stores had dropped their prices by as much as 20%. So it does creep up. The Wives Revolt was one example. If you look around the world, and this is news that doesn't get reported all that much, at least I wasn't aware of it until I really started researching, but there were serious marches and global protests over inflation and the cost of food, the cost of energy over the past few years. 140,000 people marched in Paris over the cost of essential goods and rent and so on. So, yeah, the perceived government inaction over inflation and unemployment can boil over. It causes people to spill into the streets. It causes boycotts and all kinds of displays of rage, which we haven't seen in quite that way yet, although it's starting and there are some manifestations.
What are those manifestations that we're seeing right now?
Well, one example is a Reddit group called Loblaws is Out of Control.
Right.
Which currently has more than 100,000 members. You know, it's called Loblaws is Out of Control, but it's also about highlighting just the ridiculous cost of living in Canada. And this was the group that came to prominence with the Loblaw boycott and all of the Loblaw affiliated stores. And it came out that 18% of Canadian households actively participated in that boycott. So the impact on the bottom line of Loblaws may have been marginal. I don't think we know exactly what the impact was, but Loblaws is Out of Control is still going strong. They've announced that this boycott has been extended indefinitely from the perspective of their group. So they seem undiminished in their desire to do something. So that's just one example of the way in which Canadians are starting to get fed up with the price of food in this case, but really the cost of living all told.
And while we measure things like the rate of inflation, obviously interest rates, which have fallen recently, inflation still exists, of course, but that rate has fallen too. How do we also measure how people feel about the economy beyond those raw numbers?
Right. So one way in which we measure people's feelings about the economy is through the Consumer Sentiment Survey, which is something that the Bank of Canada tracks in their Canadian Survey of Consumer Expectations is what they call it. So essentially what they do is poll thousands of Canadians for their opinions on how they're doing economically. So they ask them questions about inflation, their employment prospects, and that includes things like how secure they are in their jobs, whether or not they feel as though they have secure employment, overall perceptions of their security, their household finances. And the interesting thing here is that according to the most recent survey, Canadians' perceptions of inflation continue to be higher than actual inflation. So as you mentioned, the actual economic drivers and the actual economic indices are trending in the right direction. I mean, we don't need to get into the nuts and bolts of it, but inflation is going down. But people's perception of inflation remains high, again, because we don't think of the process of inflation over time when we're actually paying the money, right? When we're forking over the $21 for the sandwich, we don't have the larger economic context in the backs of our minds. So it's become somewhat detached from the economic drivers. But I think this is worrying for the government because, again, the perception is different from the economic drivers that are beneath it. So we all understand that there was this labor shortage during and immediately after the pandemic. But now we seem to be in this new era of job cuts and difficulty in finding work. That is very much the perception that comes across in this consumer expectation survey. So people are feeling pretty grim about the economy. And when you ask people today about their prospects for the future, they will tell you that they expect to be worse off a year from now than they are today. And that perception really spells trouble for the Liberals.
In general, and I'm talking here about, going back a few decades, how does consumer sentiment typically show up politically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if there's any sort of direct relationship at the polls between consumer sentiment and voting behavior. There's an old adage that's constantly in the headlines of it's the economy, stupid.
Right.
But the degree to which we can disentangle the actual economy, insofar as that exists beyond our perception of the economy, I think that would be hard, given everything else jangling around in the mind of a voter in a voting booth. I think it may be hard to disentangle the perception of an economy from the economy. I mean, my understanding is that there's a body of evidence that points to the relationship between inflation and other economic indicators and voting behavior. But I don't know the degree to which consumer sentiment can be pulled out of that equation, especially with everything else that's feeding into these overdetermined contexts. Like, for instance, how long the governing party's been in power and all of the other conditions that underlie the situation in which someone casts a vote.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you about what we're seeing in the federal polls, because clearly the Conservatives, whether or not consumer sentiment can kind of be attributed to voting intention or not, clearly the Conservatives have been able to harness this kind of consumer rage a bit. How have they managed to do that so effectively when it is kind of such a nebulous concept in politics in general?
Yeah, well, I think they've done it through making it, first of all, the centerpiece of their message that shows up in the sort of Axe the Tax slogan and in other ways, but also just through the simplicity of that message and through repetition of it. I mean, under Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives have made the affordability crisis a central plank of their pitch to Canadians. You may remember last fall when Poilievre argued on the floor of the House of Commons that you can buy a castle in France for a lower cost than a middle-class home in Ontario. It raises a question that I've thought about, which is the degree to which people's attachment to Canada may be more contingent than we might hope. I mean, we think of ourselves as proud Canadians, and in some contexts, we might think of ourselves as proud Torontonians or proud Montrealers or Calgarians or Vancouverites. But when life becomes unaffordable, it puts those feelings of patriotism and community into conflict with the fact that we can't afford to live at a standard in which we want. And I think that Poilievre, is rightly honing in on that conflict, that tension, and is bending the narrative, through his slogans, Axe the Tax, the way he talks about, the importance of reversing tax hikes so that Canadians can eat, heat, and house themselves. I mean, he's quite effective with these rhymes and with these slogans, and just that feeds into this perception that everything is too expensive.
And yet at the same time, I mean, you mentioned that critique by Poilievre was last fall. Basically, since the beginning of this year, the Liberals have made every move that they've made, basically, in the name of affordability, from the budget to other measures that have been announced. And yet none of it seems to break through, even though Canadians continue to state it's their number one issue. Why is that?
It's a good question. And sadly for the Liberals, I think there are two answers to this. One is that the policies that they are putting in place now won't be fully felt and reckoned with for some period of time, beyond which we'll have had the election. So we, in terms of the government's new spending, whether or not that will prove beneficial to Canadians in our pocketbooks and in our sort of daily cost of living scenarios, we won't know that for a year, 2 years, however long this will all play out. But people are mad now, right? People's finances are feeling out of control. And that's the second issue, is that it just goes to this sense of perception. It's something that we're reminded of every day. Each quotidian purchase, each rent and mortgage payment. I mean, you may know of, I certainly do, of middle-class homeowners over the last couple of years whose mortgages shot up to the point where they actually moved out. They didn't sell the house, but they moved in with family members and rented their homes out to collect the rental money, which of course drives up the rental market as well, but because they can't afford to live in their own homes. And this was not an isolated occurrence. And this simmering anger will find a political outlet. And a government, is therefore, to some degree, is left in the position of arguing against Canadians' perceptions of the economy, their own experience, forced perhaps to say that, well, things aren't as bad as they seem, or things will get better. And that's a tough sell to Canadians when they can't afford to make their rent payments tomorrow.
Here's my last question about the Liberals. Do they have some blame to take for the everything is so expensive attack? I mean, inflation went up all over the world, right? This was not just Canada that's been struggling with it. What has their role been in contributing to high prices?
Right. So Trudeau will say that he's had no role in it, or certainly diminished the role in it. He'll say, as you just said, that inflation has gone up all over the world. You can point to those protests that are happening all over the place. But Trudeau does wear some of the blame, or rather his government wears some of the blame. So for example, the price of rent, which has gone up dramatically over the last number of years, stems from the fact that the national vacancy rate has plummeted to about 1.5%. So it was twice that rate in 2020 and 2021, and it's gone down significantly. I haven't looked recently, but I think in the city of Toronto, the vacancy rate is like almost nil. Like it's like 0.5% or something like that. So when there's no housing stock on the rental market, that has downstream impacts. Rent growth averaged around 3% a year, 2.8% between 1990 and 2022. So rent growth was around 2.8% in those years. Since October of 2022, it's ballooned to about 8%. So it's rocketed up, and that has far surpassed both inflation and wage growth, and contributed to the affordability crisis. And if you ask the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they'll tell you that this increased rental demand has been driven by a surge in immigration and by post-secondary students. And that is something that falls under the government's, this is in line with immigration targets that the government has set and lived by. So, for example, the net immigration to British Columbia grew by about 56% between 2022 and 2023. The national population, and these are numbers coming from the Royal Bank of Canada, the national population grew by over 3% in 2022-23, which is the highest in decades. And again, this reflects the government's own targets in terms of immigration. Now, of course, there's a broader philosophical question to be had over immigration, and then I'm just reporting numbers from the Bank of Canada, for example.
Right.
So it's not to say no one is saying that immigration is good or bad, but when your population exceeds your housing stock, there's a fairly predictable consequence in terms of price, and we're now witnessing what that looks like.
So I guess lastly, what comes next? And what I'm trying to ask about this is, where does this consumer rage go? And I'm just going to, let's say for the sake of assumption, and because we look at the polls, that the Conservatives win the next election, whether that's later this year or next year, and your $21 sandwich doesn't drop in price, like nothing's going to drop in price. What happens to that consumer rage? Where does it get directed to Poilievre then immediately? Like, where does it go?
That is an excellent question. I don't have a crystal ball, and prophecies are obviously perilous. But ironically, people's perceptions of the first number of months of Poilievre's government will largely hinge on what the Liberals are doing right now. So, for example, one of the ways in which the Liberals have been trying to bend down the cost of rent is through their limiting of international student numbers, for example, where the government really finds itself between a rock and a hard place, where they have set hard limits on the number of international students which post-secondary institutions can admit in an attempt to bring down the competition for the rental market. Universities then say that the government is significantly hampering their ability to balance their budgets through international funds. So international tuition was many orders of magnitude more than domestic tuition. And as provincial funding has fallen for universities have made up the bottom line with international funds. And so universities are now saying that the government's attempts to limit international students are really tarring Canada's reputation abroad, that we're shooting ourselves in the foot. It's going to take a generation to pull ourselves out of this hole that the government is putting us in terms of our international standing for post-secondary education. So we're trapped between a rock and a hard place. How it all plays out is really anyone's guess. I mean, but my point is that if that is effective, if the limiting of the international students has a positive impact on the rental market, that will show up presumably under Pierre, if the polls are right, under Pierre Poilievre's term, and he may very well take credit for it. So it's messy. These things are in the realm of perception as much as they are in the realm of reality. And I'm sure you know as well as anyone, municipal politics is a big part of it in terms of new housing starts and the kinds of red tape that are involved to actually increase the new housing starts and the supply of housing. That's not a straightforward federal matter. And the degree to which Poilievre will try and take credit for or be burned by change that doesn't happen, it's going to be a fascinating part of the next 4 years.
Ira, thank you so much for this. It's a really interesting way to discuss what we're all feeling every time we go buy a sandwich.
Well, it's my pleasure. And my advice is bring your own lunch to work.
That's perfect advice. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Ira Wells, writing in The Walrus. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. I would love to hear your examples of consumer rage, sticker shock, whatever you want to call it. Candy bar is great. Sandwiches are great. If you want to send them in, we'll add them to the list for our next feedback episode. The way to do it, as you may well know, is emailing us. hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca is the address, or by calling us and leaving us a voice message, 416-935-5935. And remember, if you want us to, give us permission to use your voice on the show. The Big Story is available in all of your favorite podcast players, including Seeker, Seekr, and it's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.